We're going to start with Julian Morris from International Policy Network, followed immediately by his colleague, spouse, Kendra Okonski. Then we'll go to Michael Economides, who's from the University of Houston, and finally Ian Murray from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Julian.
Wait till you've heard what I have to say before you start having. I'm going to talk today about adapting to a changing world. It's not exclusively going to be focusing on climate change, but I'm going to discuss to a large degree the problem of climate change and how one might address it in different ways. So I'm going to start with a discussion of the hypothesized impacts of climate change. What people say might happen as a result of anthropogenic global warming. I'm then going to talk about how human beings have adapted to change over time and how they might continue to adapt in the future. I'm going to talk about the importance of addressing today's problems first, and then I'm going to discuss kind of how one might achieve that. I think that economic development is a fundamental driver of adapting to change in all circumstances. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about the real drivers of development. The reason for that being that I think there are concerns about those real drivers being undermined by certain policies that might be put in place in the context of climate change. And I'm going to finish with a very brief question about the morality of taking action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the name of addressing climate change. So let's quickly look at what the main hypothesized impacts of climate change are, and to what extent we have evidence for those hypothesized impacts so far in the record. Well, one of the main hypothesized impacts will be increased precipitation, so more rain, more snow, and so on. Is there evidence of that over the past 100 years? Actually, yes, the record suggests that there has been increased precipitation in some places over the past 100 years, so we can take that as a tick that box. Increased incidence of storms and hurricanes. Well, actually the evidence of that is equivocal. We already heard some discussion of the debate between Treadworth and Lancy and so on. The evidence is at least equivocal, and I would say we probably don't have to worry about that right now. Increased rate of reduction in glaciers. Again, yesterday we heard about the debate that's going on in the academic literature about the change in the amount of ice in Antarctica and Greenland, and it's not clear that we need to be worried about any supposed increase in rate of reduction of that. An increased rate of sea level rise. Again, there's not a lot of evidence that the rate of sea level rise has increased. It's been rising more or less since the end of the last ice age. It's not clear that it's rising at any faster rate today than it was in the past. More hot days, fewer cold days. Yes, there is some evidence of that, and as we've heard, we don't necessarily have to be too worried about there being more hot days in Siberia, and indeed, probably more importantly, fewer cold days, because people die in northerly latitudes and very southerly latitudes much more often when it's very cold than when it's very hot. And we're quite capable of adapting, as was pointed out last night, to small rises in heat in summer days. Increased disease. This is going to be discussed by Paul Wright, among others, in another track, so I'm not going to go into that, but there is actually very little evidence that the changing climate has caused any change in the disease around the world, especially things like malaria and bacterial infections and so on. There just isn't a lot of evidence that that's the case, and lots of reasons to believe that it's not the case. Changing range of species, yes, there probably is a changing range of species as a result of climate change, although there are other things that are causing the changing range of species that are much more important. We'll come back to that. What's important to note, though, is that all of the above are considered to be problems by the policymakers in the policymaker summary of the IPCC, and even more so in the Stern review, which is probably the most alarmist sort of economic analysis that we've seen on climate change. But what happens if you assume all of those supposed problems are real? So if we assume that you've got lots more precipitation, more storms and hurricanes, faster reduction in glaciers, faster rate of sea level rise, and so on. What happens when you assume all of that? Well, these figures were calculated by Indigo Clarney based on the various emission scenarios that are produced for the IPCC and used by the IPCC at Stern. And Indigo Clarney estimated that if you look going forward at these different scenarios, then the impact economically of rising sea level, rising temperatures can be put at some proportion of the change in economic growth over the next 100 years. So, most importantly, in poor countries, in 1990, GDP per capita was approximately $875 US dollars in current US dollars. By 2100, under the most fuel-intensive scenario, A1FI, the amount of economic, the GDP per capita in those poorer countries, without any climate impacts, would be 66,500. If you assume all of those climate impacts are real, though, you get a drop of 13,300. That just means that people will be only about 60 times better off rather than 70 times better off in 100 years' time. In wealthy countries, the increase it isn't from you increase from 40,500 US dollars per capita to 107,300 without any climate impacts included. When you include the impacts of climate change, it goes down to 85,840. So again, you've got a difference between a six-fold increase and a five-fold increase in a six-fold increase and a seven-fold increase in the rate of economic growth. So the conclusion of this, though, is if you're looking at rapid increases in emissions associated with rapid increases in growth, the question is, should we be concerned that people in 100 years' time in poorer countries are going to be somewhere in the region of 5 times better off, 4 to 5 times better off than people in wealthy countries today, even taking into account climate change? The same can be true, can be said about the other various scenarios that were looked at. Then, of course, Stern goes forward to 2200, of course, in his analysis, and there he says, well, there's an upper limit of losses in GDP per capita of about 35%. The thing is that under the A1 fuel intensity, the most energy inefficient, the most carbon-emitting scenario of the IPCC scenarios, the average inhabitant of the developing world, the poorest people in the world, would be better off in 2100 than the average person in the industrialized world was in 1990, even if climate change caused a reduction in GDP of about 78%, which is more than twice the amount that Stern estimates. So that's all background. What's important to note, though, is that nearly all of the hypothesized impacts of climate change are really extensions of current problems. So if we can reduce the severity of those current problems today, then they won't be problems in the future. So let's have a look. Okay, we have a problem today, not necessarily climate related, but to some extent would be considered climate related. About 10 million children, mainly, die from preventable or curable diseases every year. They die because they don't have access to clean water. They die because they have they don't have access to sanitation and so on. Malaria prevention, AIDS prevention. If those people were able to get those things, they wouldn't die. And moving forward, it wouldn't matter that climate change has changed the circumstances slightly. They still wouldn't die because they've got access to the technologies which enable them not to die. With regard to things like flooding, if you can ensure that there are flood barriers present, if you enable people to migrate, if you enable people to build houses on stilts, all sorts of adaptive responses that exist today in rich countries and indeed to a degree in poorer countries, then people won't die and they won't suffer nearly to the extent that they do today in places like Bangladesh, for example, if they're able to access those technologies or the ability to move. Heat exhaustion. Well, we heard last night about how people in different parts of the states adapt to, and Scandinavia and so on, adapt to differences in temperature. Clearly, it's possible to use technologies to address a fairly basic problem. Human societies have done this throughout time. Medieval cathedrals were built with very thick walls to prevent to provide a sanctuary for people in hot days, among other things. But fans, air conditioning, and building structures are ways of dealing with this. Crop damage, another problem which is real today. A large proportion of crops in Africa and some of the poorer countries in Latin America are lost to insects and to viruses and other problems. You can solve those problems using technology. You can use pesticides, insecticides, and herbicides and so on, and new crop varieties are being developed which enable a better adaptation to those problems. The specific problem, aridity, is now being addressed through the use of biotechnology. New crops are being developed that take up less water and are therefore able to survive in more arid climates, and indeed are more robust generally to higher temperatures. As regards the change in ranges of species, again, this can be solved, but it's going to be solved best if we look at the problem that exists today in terms of species extinction, which is largely a consequence of people changing the habitats of the animals in which, the place in which people live. I'm going to go very quickly. I was going to talk about air pollution being a real problem, because I think that we do have to differentiate between real air pollution problems and non-problems. Real air pollution problems include especially indoor air pollution, which kills about 1.5 million people a year. What's the cause of air pollution that kills people? Mainly this: people burning wood and dung in poorly flued fires in countries in South Asia and in Africa. These photos were taken in India by Kendra a few years ago, and they show a young girl, probably about 8 or 10, piling up dung cakes to dry, and then on the right you see how these dung pads are being burned. These are the causes of chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder and various other diseases which kill young children and also women who live cooked meals in huts. If we're really serious about dealing with these problems, then we're going to look at the solutions, which include enabling people to get wealthy. If you look at the relationship between wealth and health, with the exception of a few outliers, South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia in that graph, as people get wealthier, they live longer. Why do they do that? Well, a significant part of that is they have access to potable water. Another part is that they simply have economic development. This is economic development in the past 2,000 years. As you can see, most of it's happened in the past 200. And again, in the past 200, you have a massive reduction in the proportion of poor people. You've also seen, I think this is a telling graph, that given the alarmist claims made about the impact of climate change on natural disasters at the end of last year by the UN Development Programme and other organisations. If you look at the death rates in weather-related natural disasters since 1920, you see a massive reduction. It's basically a logarithmic reduction in natural disasters over that period. Largely it's because you've eliminated, to a great degree, the worst forms of natural disaster in terms of deaths, which are drought and floods. They've basically just gone. Even if you include the horrible floods of the past few years, which are included in this data, they just hardly show up. Transition of technology from one country to another is important. Improvements in nutrition. I'm going to be very quick, so I've only got a couple of minutes. But underlying all of the economic development are the fundamental institutions like property rights, the rule of law and markets. Those things actually enable people to develop. If you compare different countries which have different sets of institutions, comparing Congo, Botswana, and the United Kingdom, for example, you see that in the Congo, it's very difficult to enforce a contract. It costs you somewhere in the region of 2.5 times the amount that you might get back if you actually were successful in enforcement. not many people in the Congo are going to go to the law courts to enforce their contracts. By comparison, in Botswana and the United Kingdom, you can enforce a contract with less than a quarter of the total cost of the total likely benefits for the enforcement. So you're much more likely to do so. What are the implications for economic development? Well, over the past 30 years, 1975 to 2004, Botswana grew sixfold, the United Kingdom doubled in size, and the Congo fell by about 80%. The trouble is that if you have carbon control, you actually undermine those institutions, or you give justifications for undermining those institutions, which might lead to economic development. You divert resources away from more productive economic activities and towards carbon control. You legitimize the imposition of all sorts of restrictions. We've heard over the past few weeks only talk about imposing restrictions on trade. Both the United States and the European Union have talked about imposing trade sanctions on countries that benefit from lower carbon, the ability to emit more carbon in their industrial processes. This is just protectionism. And to legitimize protectionism on the basis of protecting the world from climate change, I think is very, very dangerous, and is almost certain to have the opposite effect of that intended in terms of enabling people to lead better lives in the future. Because you will actually harm people now and in the future, make them less able to adapt to the climates in which they live. So the question then is it morally defensible to impose these restrictions on economic activity in the name of saving people in the future? Well, in fact, you might well be harming them. Thank you.